Here we are, our final lecture for this class. And so the final piece that we're looking at then is a second chapter from my book called Kat Mai Ploi, Motherhood and Pursuits of Justice. We'll get back to the significance of the term Kat Mai Ploi. What we need to know now for the moment is only that it means bite and don't release. Sort of the equivalent in English would be dig your heels in, something like that, which is a slightly less violent kind of thing. But you'll see why that matters. Okay. In a curious way, this chapter doesn't quite fit with the narrative of some of the other chapters in the book. Why? Because the two characters that we look at, the two central individuals in the cases that this chapter addresses, they did not initially conceive of their cases as human rights cases. They thought of them in different terms, having to do with justice, having to do with rights, but not human rights per se. So it's the way the human rights figures in their case is not exactly as the central organizing theme, and yet the development of the Human Rights Commission toward the end of the two struggles was crucial to arriving at a resolution in each of these cases. In a way, I think you can safely say that it's not a coincidence that the creation of the Human Rights Commission came so close to the end of their struggles because of the way that the commission figured in resolving their two struggles. Okay, whoops. So the two figures who we're looking at are Ratana who you see seated in before the fans at the desk there, and then Yai Hai. Yai Hai lives in the northeast of Thailand, very close to the border with Laos, in an area called Isan. And Ratana lived in Bangkok, in Bung Khum district. It's a sort of a suburb of Bangkok, a residential area in Bangkok. And so these are the two whose cases we track through this chapter. Their struggles, the way that I'm presenting them, sort of have three main tropes or three lenses that focus their cases. One has to do with citizenship, with their status as Thai citizens. One has to do with motherhood, the fact that each is a mother. And then the third has to do with an idea of gesture that I develop to try and explain how it is that they undertook their struggles, at least at the times when I was tracking them. We start then with citizenship. So it's important to note then, they're both citizens of Thailand. And that's going to contrast in important ways with the status of the Burmese migrants who we looked at in previous chapters, who did not have that privilege and who experienced really dramatic vulnerability as a consequence, not only as a consequence of as not being citizens, because there are other people who were in Thailand but not citizens who were still able to lay claim to rights. But the fact that Burmese migrants were both Burmese, with that history with Thailand, and that they couldn't claim citizenship and the rights of citizenship were consequential. Equally, the fact that Yai Hai and Ratana were both citizens was also consequential for their cases. It configured the way that they would undertake their struggles, the expectations that they would have for the delivery of justice and the response that they got both from officials and from the public at large. Now, the fact that they were citizens, though, didn't mean that that made things easy. Not at all. They struggled for decades. So when I met them in 2005, Yaihai had been struggling for over 25 years at that point. Ratana had been struggling for a full decade by that point with their particular cases. Each one had just reached a crucial moment in her struggle, and in part, as I say, facilitated by the presence of the Human Rights Commission, but the particular dramatic gestures that they took were not a function of the Human Rights Commission. They were gestures of a more sort of desperate sort. They had arrived at these positions of struggling for decades because they had not been able to get a proper hearing, no matter that they had gone through all of the proper channels to try and get one. So that Yaihai, for example, had appealed her case at every level of political representation, from the district all the way up to the Prime Minister. They had tried to gain access to all of the legal mechanisms that were available to them to plead their cases, but they had been shut out. Part of what I promote then in this chapter is the idea that at those places where speech had failed to get results, right, where pleading their case had failed to get results, they turned instead to gestures, these dramatic, powerful gestures that in each case emphasized their status as mothers. And that those two things in particular, the nature of gesture and performing their gestures as mothers, those were the linchpins to the successes that they eventually had in their cases. So with the idea of gesture, I rely on a distinction between saying and showing. And it's best to clarify that. So it's a notion that I'm borrowing from the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. That's not especially important. You can see that in the notes of the book if you want. But I want to draw on the distinction that he makes as a way of getting at the nature of the particular forms of protest, forms of struggle that they were taking. Now, of course, sometimes saying something is showing, so that the distinction between saying and showing isn't just a sort of straightforward one of whether one is speaking or not. So that, as an example, if I say, I'm in pain, then following the philosophy of Wittgenstein, that's not like I'm giving you some description of myself. It's not like I'm giving you some data points for your interest. It is a way of showing my pain. So that saying I'm in pain is showing my pain in the same way that screaming or saying ouch, those are also ways of showing that I'm in pain. What I want to draw attention to then is that there's an expressiveness in that, in saying I'm in pain, such that my saying it is not, again, organized around this idea of communicating a particular bundle of knowledge or a bundle of information or something like that. It's about expressing my pain. And so the parallel that I'm drawing is that gesture is doing a similar kind of work, that it's expressive in nature. And it's expressive in a way that in their cases, Yaihai and Ratana, that was doing work that speech itself could not. When the sort of the start of the major changes for Ratana were when was when she painted her house black. So she had this house. Um, it was built on a plot that was supposed to be reserved for a vehicle turnaround. So there wasn't supposed to be a house there at all. Yet she had purchased the house. The house had been built, having been given the permits by the city and by the district. And when her neighbor, I don't know if it's the neighbor who's visible in this particular image or if it's another neighbor, but when a neighbor was doing renovations on the neighboring house, Ratana started to get cracks in her own walls. And so she had gone to the city and the district officials to ask that there be a halt to the renovations. And it was then that the city came back and the district came back and said, your house isn't supposed to be there at all. You have to move out. We're going to demolish your house. And so she engaged, as I say, in this decade-long struggle to keep her place. And at one point, to try and help publicize her cause, she painted the entire facade black. The idea here then was that making such a gesture that sort of alludes to funereal themes of death and so forth, that such a gesture would be the kind of thing that would have the kind of jarring effect to create the conditions in which a conversation could occur. A conversation, for example, that could allow for negotiation over what would come of her house. Her agenda being to remain in the house, of course. And as a kind of a media stunt sounds derisive, and I don't mean it in a derisive way. So that said, as a kind of media stunt to advertise that she was going to have this public panel discussion at Thammasat University in the near future, it was fairly effective. That it got media attention. And so people were aware of her struggle at this point. She was in the news, and she was able to mobilize a fair bit of sympathy within the public broadly. And that was good. That was important for her. But again, the reason that it worked was because of this particular gesture that she made. It was not the last gesture. This was one on the way to a more dramatic gesture, but this was an important one. When that didn't work, when the city and the district, the very same officials who had granted the permit to Thai Erawan, the company that had the developer rather, who had built the house in the first place, when those very same officials still declined to hear her out, still declined to let her house remain standing, still were pushing to evict her, she did eventually abandon her house and she set up camp in front of City Hall. So you can see here that she's got a fairly large tent here, and she dressed it with banners of all sorts. Most of the banners were directed toward City Hall. So in the top image, you can see a photo taken from the square in front of City Hall that is toward City Hall. And you can see that there are some banners, but that the view from the other side, the side facing City Hall, that the governor of the city, Bangkok doesn't have a mayor, it has a governor. So that the governor would look out on and see, that's where all of these other banners were. And again, I think that you can take these banners as the sort of communicative use of language to describe the situation that she's in. But I think that you can also take them as expressive, as gestural, in the same way that establishing this camp is this sort of grand gesture of a sort. Saying that she is going to sit here in front of City Hall until she either gets justice or dies. And that was exactly her claim, is that it would be one or the other. And and so in these terms, the point that I'm trying to get at is that the negotiations that she was eventually able to enter into with the governor, mediated by the Human Rights Commission, happened largely because she was willing to make this sort of gesture. Not just willing, but that she actually made it. Of course, making the gesture is crucial. And so she was out here for months. And a lot of the time that she was there, so she was there for part of the rainy season and for part of the hot season. That's a rough time to be just out on this square that has no shade aside from her tent, with the sun beating down on it day after day. This took some dedication. This was not a choice for an easy solution. This was a kind of desperate move. So on the one hand, both Yaihai and Ratana were demanding their rights as citizens, so that positioning herself at the city gates like that, at the relevant authority, is making a certain kind of claim on citizenship that harkens back to the Sukhothai era, so in the 1200s, under King Ramkhamhaeng, with the idea that if you had a claim to make, if you needed adjudication in order to attain justice, you could ring this bell that the king had hung outside his gate, and he would come and give justice, right? He would adjudicate whatever the case was in a just way. So that there's a direct parallel here then with Ratana positioning herself directly in front of the gates of City Hall in order to demand justice. This was something that was available in the Sukhothai era as a subject of the king. In the case of Ratana, as a citizen, right? So that citizenship then is crucial. And the same holds for Yaihai. She was claiming that that her land, which had been flooded in the process of building a dam, and she claimed she had not signed over her land. She had not received compensation for her land. She had been offered but had refused, so that she was claiming in part that her rights as a citizen were violated, that the government is not allowed simply to come and appropriate land in that way, without the consent of the landowner. So in those respects, the notion of citizen was important. On the other, and I think more powerfully, they were always presenting themselves as mothers. They always emphasized their status as mothers, so that all of their expressions of pain and outrage were the pain and outrage specifically as mothers, so that other people might have particular sorts of struggles or injustices that they wanted to publicize, but that they wouldn't necessarily be drawing on that model of it's not even a part of the argument that I make is that it's not even a model just about gender. The gender analysis isn't enough to understand what's going on here. That it's specifically motherhood that's important. So, by way of example, there was another woman around this time after Ratana had established her camp. So Ratana, I think, provided a kind of model here for this woman. The woman's name was Pen Silaket, and she had purchased a Honda, and it was not working properly. It wouldn't start reliably. There were funny noises. There were a bunch of things that were going wrong with it, making it basically unusable car, or at least not reliably usable. And so she had tried to get it repaired. She had tried to exchange it for a new car because these problems had been there from the beginning when she had initially purchased the car. And she just wasn't getting anywhere with Honda. So eventually what she did is she parked her car, I think outside the headquarters of Honda in Bangkok. And then so put a bunch of banners over it explaining what was going on and why she was so frustrated with them, and then took a pickaxe, a shovel, and just demolished her car. Also, she had the presence of mind to get the media involved so that the media were there to cover her doing this. And so staging it in that way was very important, and it brought about a positive result for her from Honda. They replaced her car eventually, and apologized publicly, which is no small thing. And so there's a way that she was able to draw on this model that Ratana had already established as a consumer under this rubric of consumer rights, right? Because they were both consumers who had gotten products that were not what they claimed to be. And so Ratana positioning herself in front of City Hall with all of the banners on the tent has a direct analogy with Din Pen also positioning her car right in front of Honda's headquarters, also dressing it with banners, and then demolishing it. The difference, though, is that Din Pen was presenting her case as a consumer who had been wronged, a consumer who was not getting her due. Ratana and Yai Hai are working on, I say, a completely different level because of the way that they are able to invoke motherhood, that their positioning as mothers is absolutely crucial, and it brings an entirely different quality to their struggles and to their demands. So then presenting themselves first and foremost as mothers fighting for their children, for justice for their children, for justice for themselves, but especially justice for their children, that had a particular kind of resonance with Thai people of all walks of life. Why? Because the image of motherhood has a special kind of moral authority and a special kind of appeal within Thailand. Of course, it does in other places as well, but the relevant thing is how it does in Thailand. So this the key aspect of motherhood is that it entails this change of status, that when you become a mother, that you take on this elevated status, you take on this kind of moral stature that is almost unequaled anywhere else in Thai society. Monks would probably be an exception to that, and royalty would be an exception to that. But that motherhood, which incidentally is not something that you get simply by giving birth, because of course Other kinds of animals do that as well. So it's not just the giving birth that confers this status on you, but there's a kind of ritual practice that goes along with becoming a mother. And so the argument goes, it's this passage of rites that confers this status on you. And the status is one that, as I say, has this kind of moral authority that is almost unequaled elsewhere in society. So then they rely on this. They present this. They are presenting themselves as mothers throughout their struggles. Because enacting this authority depends on maintaining the particularity of motherhood, however, it also means that the range of actions open to them is somewhat constrained, right? That if they're going to present themselves as mothers and claim the moral authority that goes along with mothers, then there are ways that they need to conform to the model of motherhood in order to sustain this claim on moral authority. They did not do this in the same ways. They overlap on some points, but in important ways, they embody motherhood in distinctive ways. So Ratana's presentation of motherhood turned entirely on this idea of the self-sacrificing mother who, out of obligation, because she has this moral obligation as a mother, out of obligation fights on behalf of her children. That's the moral authority that she gains is also a moral obligation, and that obligation requires self-sacrifice. And so that's the way that she presents herself. The notion of being a mother who is a victim is a key element in her struggle, in her self-presentation, and in her decision to camp out in front of City Hall. That she is, in a sense, stripping herself of all otherworldly belonging, giving up her house, giving up her belongings, and throwing herself on at the gate of City Hall to demand justice, but doing so very much in the sense of the mother who has sacrificed in order to arrive at that place. Yai Hai is quite different. So her presentation of motherhood is much more this kind of ferocious figure who will fight to the death for her children. The image that Ratana gave me of Yai Hai, she knew who Yai Hai was, of course, because Yai Hai's struggle had been going on for decades by the time that Ratana even began hers. And she had already been in the press for some time before that. So she knew who Yai Hai was. Her explanation was, she drew on a motif. She said that there's this idea of the particular fearsomeness of the king cobra, which, interestingly enough, Mabia is the name. It has the name Ma, mother, in its name. There you go. So she said that Yai Hai is like the king cobra, that it sinks its teeth in and won't let go in defense of her children. Hence the title of the chapter, Kat Mai Ploi. So bite, don't release. That this is the model of the fierce cobra who will sink her teeth in and won't let go in order to defend herself and especially her children. We can see this contrast in the different ways that they undertook their gestures as well. These gestures that are demands for justice. So, as I say, Ratana exhibited her victimhood, abandoning her home to establish her camp in this extraordinarily public place. laying bare for all to see the desperation of her situation. This massive square, which you can see here without her tent, in front of City Hall. And so there's a way of displaying her deprivation at that point, displaying the sacrifice that she's had to make, displaying the victimization she's had to endure. All of this, like saying, I'm in pain, is a gesture seeking acknowledgement, right? So that this is the point that Wittgenstein makes when he discusses pain, the utterance, I am in pain. He says, again, it's not about telling you something about myself or my state. It is seeking acknowledgement. That when I say to you, I am in pain, I want you to acknowledge that I'm in pain. That there's a way that making that utterance is putting our future together at stake. If you're not willing to recognize it as an expression of pain, as a gesture seeking acknowledgement, then it's possible that we don't have a future together. This is the same kind of thing I'm claiming that Rathenau is doing. Displaying herself in this way is a gesture seeking acknowledgement of the wrong that she and her children have had to endure. Now, it was absolutely common when you would see her on TV or in the newspapers that she would be crying. Justifiably. I'm not saying that she was doing this cynically. I'm not saying that this was some carefully calibrated, deliberate choice that she was making to say, if I start crying now, I'm going to get the greatest response. No, I think that her tears were absolutely genuine, but they were the tears of a mother. They were born of her motherhood and her anger and anguish and frustration at the injustices that she was having to endure as a mother. So she was crying a mother's tears, and for everyone to see. She was not shy about it. She was not ashamed about doing it. She did not try to cover it up. She never tried to apologize for it, but neither did she try to restrain them. Again, I'd say she was allowing her tears to express her anguish, her anger, her dismay, her flirting with hopelessness at the situation that she was in. And the result was that she got support from all over the country. So in the photo that we saw earlier in her tent, you could see that she was surrounded by stuff. She had a desk, she had a washing machine for her clothes, that some kind city functionary had hooked up to electricity and the water supply for her. So that was interesting. Not everybody within the city bureaucracy was against her. And all of there were monetary donations that you could see that were displayed. Everything that was in that tent had been donated to her. So she really received a significant outpouring of support, not just spiritual support, that to be sure, but also important material support. And so in that way, her gestures were receiving the acknowledgement she sought from the public at large. And that, I think, would become an important factor in her ability finally to negotiate a solution that she could live with. Yai Hai was the opposite. Nothing about Yai Hai says victim. Nothing. She was fierce. So then she also decried her injustice, but her grand gesture was not to sort of prostrate herself, not to show her deprivation, it was to attack. And specifically, she attacked the retaining wall that was keeping the water on her land, keeping her land flooded. So she and members of her family went at it with farming tools, with hoes, with pickaxes, with spades, and this is reinforced concrete, right? So this is not easy work, but they battered it until eventually they had punctured it. They had chosen a spot right over a sluice, so that when the water ran off, it ran into this sluice. It didn't just flood the neighbor's land. But nonetheless, that was their response after having appealed her case, as I say, at all levels of government, from the district to the region, all the way up to the prime minister, having made herself a presence in the media, having sought legal help, having gone to NGOs that work around things like citizens' rights with respect to dams and the maintenance of rivers and so on. When all of those things had failed, this was the gesture that she undertook. And so puncturing the wall allowed the water to run off. Her land, of course, was still unfarmable at that point. It had been underwater for decades. So, so that was a problem. But arguably, the point was not that she wanted to start farming her land the next day. The point was that she wanted to show her resilience, her anger, and her ferociousness. She did this again as a mother, so that once again, in every interview that you see with her, and she got some very, very important media coverage from a TV documentarian who was quite high profile. And so he went and he spent time there as they were leading up to the destruction of this retaining wall. She was always referring to herself as Ma. She, not even by name, just by her position as mother. The media and the public at large would refer to her as Yai, which means mother's mother. So not just grandmother, right? That you have distinct terms for maternal grandmother and paternal grandmother. So mother's mother is especially an especially potent sort of position or figure. She would not refer to herself as Yai. That was something that others did, but she would refer to herself always as mother. Equally, her children, who were adult, would refer to her as mother. Always then keeping at the forefront the point that she was a mother. She was doing this as a mother. She was also, we would learn as we dig into it a little bit more deeply, she was also doing this as a daughter because her parents had lived and died on that land. And so her attachment to the land was importantly connected to her genealogy and the sort of spiritual connection that she felt to the land on the strength of that. But that's not really the crux of her self-presentation. Her self-presentation is as a mother. And she absolutely embodied this image of the ferocious cobra who will sink her teeth in and fight you in order to defend her land and her children. The symbolic importance of motherhood then wasn't only a sort of symbolic presentation involved in gestures, though. So that wasn't the only symbolic presentation. That's what I'm trying to say. That there were other things involved as well. So, as I was saying before, when Ratana positions herself in front of City Hall in the way that she did, she's evoking King Ramkhamhaeng of Sukhothai, right? So that Ramkhamhaeng is probably the most famous king of all the kings that ordinary Thai people would know. If anyone were, if just sort of a regular run-of-the-mill Thai person were asked, like, who's the first most important king in Thailand's history, most people would come up with King Ramkhamhaeng. And so Sukhothai was one dynasty. Then there was an intervening dynasty, Ayutthaya. Ayutthaya is a city probably an hour north of drive north of Bangkok. And then the Chakri dynasty is the current one, centered in Bangkok. But the idea then is that there is this lineage of the current dynasty that goes back to Sukhothai. And so he's the one who most Thai people would identify as the sort of the father of Thai-ness, of the contemporary Thai nation. And he was credited with ending slavery, or actually with abolishing slavery within the kingdom, with having sort of a constitution that, again, this is the 1200s, so it predated any European constitution, certainly predated the American Constitution, so that there are some who would credit him with creating the notion of constitutional governance in the first place. And so he's a highly revered figure. So Ratana then never spoke as if she was trying to invoke Ramkhamhaeng or Sukhothai, but there's a way that this image lives in the collective imagination of what it is to be Thai and what it is to be a Thai citizen. And she would be evoking that image, evoking the image of the citizen who rings the bell in order to receive justice. A model, incidentally, that was repeated by kings in the Chakri dynasty, the current dynasty, who didn't have a bell but had a drum that you could also come and hit to have your case heard by the king. So it was a powerful model, anyway, is the point. And Ratana's ability to evoke that model, to position herself as a citizen deserving of justice, that was also symbolically important and potent. Equally, in Yai Hai's case, when they punctured the wall, as they were about to sort of break through it once and for all, they made offerings to water spirits. They had monks come and make merit to the spirits in the land and the water, so that they were floating like lotuses down the channel that the water flowed after they punctured the wall. And so these were important things for them to do in their own right, to pay tribute to the spirits they take to inhabit the land and the water. But also, again, they're symbolically powerful acts, right? That as gestures go, they are immediately recognizable and valued and deemed proper by the people in the area, but also the area being Isan, but also more broadly through the country. It's a way of doing things in, as it were, the right way, maintaining a certain kind of moral propriety that would be recognizable and would be valued by people who saw it. And of course, people did see it because the documentarian was there capturing it as they did it. So again, just as with Ratana's tears, I don't see anything that suggests that they were doing this cynically or in a calculated way. They were doing it with absolute sincerity. But the fact that they were doing it also had this tremendous symbolic value, and it gave what they were doing a kind of moral authority that supplemented the moral authority of doing it under the rubric of motherhood. Now, they both also talked about being prepared to die on the land that they inhabited. So in Ratana's case, so this was I was present when she said this, and it was hard to tell what she meant. So she had just been contrasting her situation out in the heat in the middle of this square. Again, not a tree anywhere nearby, no relief from the heat except what the fans could provide. So contrasting her position and her kids' position out there in the tent in the heat, prepared to suffer for their cause, to the governor who was inside in his nice air-conditioned office, able to look out the windows and see her tent and see her out there if he wished. And so she talked of being prepared to die and to haunt. It wasn't clear to me if she was saying that in death she would haunt the governor or if she would haunt the land that she was on. In either case, though, the important thing is that there was a certain kind of spiritual aspect to what she was undertaking there. That as she saw it, it wasn't simply a case of a consumer getting her rights, that she was in a sense wagering her soul on this. The idea of being a ghost that haunts, it's not a happy existence to be that kind of a ghost in Thai folklore. So then that would be a kind of perpetuation of suffering that she was willing to hazard in this pursuit of justice. Yaihai, on the other hand, declaring that she actually desired to die on her land, had more to do with this idea of maintaining the continuity of her genealogy, that her ancestors were literally and figuratively in this land. They had died on this land, and their not just their bodies, but then their spirits became part of the land. And that was her wish, was to continue in that heritage. That's the proper thing in her view. So then her notion of being prepared to die in this land has that different valence to it. But either way, she's still, as she says, prepared to die on her land in pursuit of her justice, but also as a way of laying a spiritual claim to this land and to the literal genealogy that she sees inhabiting this land with her ancestors. So then this is an important distinction between them. Ratana absolutely proclaimed an injustice. Right? That was never in question. But the injustice that she was decrying was corruption. It was corruption that the officials had given Thai Erawan, the developer, the permits to build on this lot that they knew was not supposed to be built on. And so she's alleging that there were kickbacks in order to get these permits. But the house that she wanted to maintain but that would ultimately be destroyed could be replaced by another house. So she didn't have that same kind of ancestral link to this particular house. She wanted this house. She wanted to continue living in this house. She had chosen to live there after all. But there is a way that one could be substituted for another. And so this is part of the reason that an element of her struggle was as consumer rights. And so a consumer is someone who can accept a duplicate of the damaged thing, just as Denpen did with her car. So then what she wanted ultimately then was, and what she got was compensation, the ability to move to a new place, using that compensation. Compensation paid by more than one figure, so by the developer, but also by the city and by the district, and that these would be admissions of guilt, right? So that, and there was a promise of an inquest to unearth the corruption involved in this. But for her purposes, she didn't wait until that inquest was initiated. The compensation and the admission of guilt were adequate, and so she took those and then found a new place to live, and was content that she had received an adequate measure of justice. For Yai Hai, it's a completely different thing. There's no sense of being a consumer who has a good that can be replaced with another good, a good that's been damaged, or a good that is being taken from you by corrupt means and therefore can be compensated in some way. No, there's no replacing the land that she was on, because again, this was the ancestral land, and so there's no swapping that land out for another plot of land as if all land is the same. No. So then there was no deal to strike in that respect. And in fact, when so I met her at a Mother's Day celebration where she was being honored along with other women, and she was being honored specifically for her struggle. And so I got to talk with her and her daughter, happily with an interpreter, because she speaks a dialect from Isan that was hard for me to follow. But anyway, so there we were, and she was telling me about being offered this money for her land, the very money that she had declined in the first place because she was not prepared to give up her land. And to demonstrate her response, she shoved me so hard she nearly knocked me out of my chair. It was absolutely hilarious. And so I had no problem at all believing that she was sincere in her refusal of that money, but also just what a ferocious opponent she would be as she pursued justice in her case. So then, ultimately, again, with the mediation of the Human Rights Commission, she did get to drain her land. Initially, the police intervened and made her and her family repair the wall, but ultimately, after mediation, they allowed the water to run off her land. She was given compensation for the decades that they had not been able to farm that land, and they were given compensation to restore the land to fertility, because of course it was completely useless after having been underwater for so long. They couldn't farm it for some period of time. So then she also ultimately got justice, albeit in a different way. She got justice by reclaiming her land and reclaiming her ancestry on that land. So then the final key to their ability in the end to prevail was media exposure, so that their gestures were successful in garnering this support from really all across Thailand and from people from all walks of life. They prevailed in setting the conditions that they could enter into negotiations through their gestures, and through those negotiations ultimately gain, again, as I say, a kind of justice that they could live with. They could do all of that only because their gestures were visible through the media, so that a gesture that nobody sees, in other words, has none of that kind of potency, none of that power to produce the conditions for a conversation, for negotiation. And so the performance of their gestures in the very public way that they did it before the media. So getting media involved through the NGO networks that Yai Hai engaged with, through the media that Ratana contacted in Bangkok. This was a crucial element, right? That this gave them the kind of visibility that they needed for their dynamic and important gestures to gain traction. And therefore to put the government, the different levels of government, on their heels somewhat, and to feel like they actually did need to do something in response to these two women's, these two mothers' claims that they had experienced injustice, and they were demanding a just response. So then, in their cases, in both of their cases, their gestures became so powerful, not just because they were visible, but because as forms of expression, they tapped into these deep symbolic repertoires. Principally motherhood, that was, I believe, the most powerful one, the one that had the most resonance with Thai people generally, but also with the heritage of King Ramkhamhaeng and all of the important spiritual and religious convictions on Yai Hai's side. So then with that, the point that I want to get to with this then is that there are ways that they pursued what could, I think, in a straightforward way, be seen as human rights claims. And indeed, the presence of the Human Rights Commission as a mediator and as sort of an advocate for them that had its own importance, its own presence, its own authority. It was crucial. They came in at pivotal moments in these two mothers' struggles and were able to stand up for them in a way. But at the same time, neither one of them needed to invoke the language of human rights, needed to name what they were doing human rights, that they were able to pursue it in their own terms, largely in the terms of mothers fighting for justice, mothers fighting for their children, mothers who were standing up with their particular authority for specific kind of moral principles. And that what we can see then is that some things that will fall under the umbrella of human rights need not present themselves as human rights, need not invoke the language of human rights in order still to get the kind of resolution, the kind of justice that is relevant to a human rights claim or a human rights venture. And that's it. So I hope then that this class has been interesting and rewarding for you. And thank you for your attention.